modern American church's relationship with government is beyond strange. I mean, politicians stay away from Christianity until it's election time, and then they try and convince us that they're true believers. Churches say politics are beneath us, but then spend millions of dollars on lobbying efforts to turn Christian morality into law. We have a separation of church and state, but without the privileged tax status that the government allows churches and clergy to enjoy, many congregations would have to close. We celebrate voting, but then we proclaim the winner to be God's elect, if they're from our preferred party, that is. We remember how wonderful it was for our ancestors to find a land where they could worship God as they chose, but we are terrified of anything that chips away at our religion being the dominant one that people choose. How did we get in this situation? Well, Jesus lived and died in an atmosphere where faith and politics were far more tightly wound even than today. The people remembered a time when their high priest and their king were the same person. And they looked for a savior who would bring people back to God as well as kill all of their enemies here on earth. Even under Roman rule, the Sanhedrin, the ruling Jewish religious body, were deeply involved in politics, even citing that as a reason to execute Jesus. Don't you know that it's better that one man dies than that the whole nation is destroyed? That is a political statement about their fears that Jesus' large crowds would roil up the Romans into committing more reprisals against the Jewish people. In this setting, Christians took a surprisingly different direction. Kicked out of Jewish society early on and parasites in Roman circles, Christians distanced themselves from all politics and instead operated under the radar, so to speak, outside of any official position. Even as late as 250, the Roman philosopher Celsus was complaining that Christians refused to join the military or hold any public office. Christians were mostly outcasts and poor, and they saw themselves as subjects of a divine nation, the church, and so mere national rules didn't really matter a great deal to them. They had nothing to lose, so the Roman Empire could do whatever it wanted, and they would continue doing what they felt was right. Now, this all changed when Constantine halted the persecution of Christians and, in fact, elevated Christianity out of the shadows and into prominence. He gave the church buildings for the first time and began making sure that the clergy was paid. Suddenly, the church had something to lose. It had an investment and a reason to work to maintain the empire. And sure enough, Christians began joining public service and the military. When church councils were held, it was the emperor who called them together, the emperor who presided over them, even if he was not involved directly in the discussion and the verdicts. And this said quite clearly that the emperor was the final say on matters of faith and church. And for centuries, that was true. I mean, the church began to rely upon state sponsorship, and its fate was tied up with the fate of an institution, the Roman Empire, and its leader. But as the empire began to fade in the West, people still looked for a leader, and in a bid to decide his own fate instead of having his fate decided for him by the state, the head of the church in the West, the Pope, slowly began to take on much of the mantle of secular leadership too. It was the Pope Leo I who negotiated with Attila the Hun in 452, before Attila left Italy, and who also convinced the Vandals not to burn down the city of Rome itself when they sacked it a few years later. With a failing secular authority, the religious authority took over the role of the state, even at times having its own army and borders. And it certainly collected taxes from the citizens to pay for all of those churches and monasteries that the old empire had once supported. But soon the Pope would get a stark reminder that while he might want to be the ultimate authority over the state, he did not actually want the hassles that came with ruling a nation. Pope Leo III was attacked by men literally trying to tear his tongue out, which forced him to escape into the arms of an upstart ruler named Charlemagne, who the Pope managed to convince to come to Rome as his muscle, where Leo promptly crowned Charlemagne Roman Emperor. And in doing so, the Pope solidified two things. First, that secular authority only exists because religious authority grants it. And second, that the Church, and the Pope in particular, needed a protector. But there are still a lot of questions about who was in charge of whom. Later on, the Holy Roman Emperor got in the habit of appointing the Church's bishops on his own authority. I mean, after all, they were in his kingdom, why not? Well, the Pope got miffed at this, seeing secular authority overstepping its bounds. They argued about it, and the Pope ended up kicking the emperor out of the church, excommunicated. The people started to riot, nobles met to elect a new emperor, and in the winter of 1077, Emperor Henry IV trekked through the mountains of northern Italy to see the Pope, waiting 3 days in the cold to see him, and eventually walking barefoot through the snow to the Pope before begging his forgiveness. That's the sort of power that the Pope had over the head of state. But that power also had limits. When the Pope excommunicated Henry again, Henry came back with an army this time, overthrew the Pope, and installed his own anti-Pope in his place. One that would be much more yielding of authority to Henry's royal will. Church and state were fighting for the same power and using many of the same tactics. The next real pope who took over did so with the anti-pope still in place, and with way too many armies roaming around Europe for his taste. He needed to do something to once again show the secular states that the church was actually in charge, and also get those armies out of the way. Fortunately, he had just gotten a letter from the Byzantine Empire asking for some help out east, and in 1095, Pope Urban II called for a crusade, a holy war in the Holy Land, which aligned all the Western nations with the Pope's will. Now, this was only a generation after the Eastern and Western churches finally split for good, so this was a great time to reassert Western Christianity's authority back in the East. And it worked. The states yielded to the church, joined together in a series of crusades, fighting and killing infidels for God instead of killing each other. And when the Crusades had conquered parts of the Holy Land, they set up secular states, the church birthing a nation with the Pope over everything. And this sort of control continued throughout the medieval period, with the Pope acting as final authority on pretty much everything, which really grated on the kings and queens of the era. So when the Reformation hit, many rulers got on board with it, not so much because of their faith, but because it offered freedom from the Pope. That these rulers could now decide their own fate. But don't get misled and think that this was some idyllic time of religious freedom. It wasn't. A person's religion was still dictated by the religion of their ruler. And while religious change could come with a new ruler, you were still expected to align with those new beliefs or suffer persecution or even death, which in times of chaos caused a serious issue. Take the city of Munster, Germany, for instance. It was originally Catholic, but embraced Lutheran leaders and converted to Protestantism once the bishop prince of the region allowed it. But in 1534, another reforming group, the Anabaptists, took over the city and the religion changed again. 3 religious changes in about a year. This time, though, things got weird, and the perfect theocracy promised became a nightmare of tyranny, as anyone who disagreed with the new form of Christianity suddenly shoved on everybody could be kicked out of the city or executed. The priest/bishop, a man called Waldeck, quickly laid siege to the city, killing the leaders of the revolt and hanging their bodies in cages on the side of the cathedral. Side tangent, those cages are actually still there today, or replicas of them anyway. Back to Catholicism for the people of Munster, except that Waldeck wanted to hand off his land to his children, something that he couldn't do as a Catholic bishop. So he spent his remaining time trying to push for the Reformation in his area, so he could secularize it and pass on the rule to his kids. Church and state were still jostling for the same power, and even in the Reformation, if the Pope didn't decide your faith, your local ruler still did. The best example of this on a national level is the Church of England. Basically, Henry VIII, the King of England, wanted to be able to divorce whoever he wanted, and was annoyed at how much more money and land the Catholic Church had in England than he did. So in 1534, he made the ruler of England the hereditary head of the Church of England, seizing power from the Catholic Church, and sold most of the monasteries to raise money. He did not want to have the church tell him what to do, so he took control of the church. The problem, however, was the same as in Munster. If the leader changes the religion, what happens when the leader changes? Sure enough, Henry's daughter, Mary I, reversed course during her reign and brought England back towards Catholicism. But then her sister, Elizabeth I, flipped course again. For centuries, the Church of England sometimes leaned Protestant, sometimes Catholic in their beliefs, depending on the politics of the day. It didn't matter how new the king or queen's beliefs were. All that mattered was that they were the head of the church, and so everyone needed to believe as they said. This led to massive confusion among the people, who would get excited about reforms only to have their dreams crushed with a change in the political winds. And they would be forced underground or even out of the country. At some points, it got so bad that priests would get in trouble for teaching what they had learned in seminary because the entire beliefs of the church had shifted since then, and they were now labeled heretics. This sort of instability all over Europe drove many people to flee their countries. And as the Reformation came about the same time as the discovery of the Americas, many groups who didn't have a protector for their particular brand of religion fled west. Individual colonies started popping up, some with a persecuted sect as the official religion, like the Puritans of Massachusetts, while others like Pennsylvania established freedom to practice any religion. When some of those colonies got together to form the United States, they kept in mind the power struggles that they had been witness to between church and state. And in particular, they kept in mind the destruction that can happen when the leader of the state could also claim to be God's instrument and dictate faith as well. So part of the creation of this new nation involved creating freedom of religion, where people could worship without fear of persecution just because the ruler didn't agree with them. But even though that should have settled it, you can still see remnants of that age-old struggle in American politics today, where the church really wants to be in charge and be able to dictate terms to the state, and the government tries to put limits on how much the church can say against them. It's not perfect by any means, but at least the government can't tell us how to worship, and the church can't order us to start a war anymore. I hope you've enjoyed this brief look into the history of church and state relations. Obviously, in this short of time, this was a gross summation, bordering on oversimplification, I'm afraid. But sometimes it's important to take a step back and get the big picture view of how we got here. I hope it was helpful, and I hope you'll come back next Friday when I'll be taking a look at why churches always seem to need so much money in America. If you want to see some of my other videos about history, check out the link over here. And if you want to start this series from the beginning, check out the link over here. As always, thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great week. See you next Friday.